Home Recruiter Podcast. I'm your host, Brett Clementson. Today, we have a few extra faces in the room. Jon from our office. Jon, how are you going?
Very well.
And Elizabeth Aitken, partner. I'm good. Partner at SLF, one of the youngest partners when she was appointed. And here today, because you're an employment lawyer, is that correct?
That's exactly right.
Yes, I got it right. Everyone knows and everyone's read about it, everyone's seen it, this right to disconnect reform. And we've seen the headlines, we've looked at the reform, we've seen the articles, but why I wanted to get you in was that you're the expert, and I think there's a few bits and pieces between the cracks that I really want to address, and just to make sure that everyone is on the same page and ultimately doesn't, find themselves in hot water, right? So, let's just start with what is the right to disconnect reform. It's a Fair Work Ombudsman. They've put this thing out. I'm assuming there was a requirement for it. I mean, I want to start with there. Is this something that keeps coming up that you felt this piece of legislation needed to come into place, or did it come out of nowhere?
Well, look, I think that there has always been discussion around what working hours are reasonable, certainly in Australia and beyond, what are employees' expectations around the balance between work and home life. But I think that the right to disconnect was in itself, in a way, quite surprising. It was a fairly controversial reform that the government pushed through at the last minute when the second closing loopholes bill was passed. And there wasn't a great deal of consultation with business before that was passed. It's amended a really central piece of workplace legislation, which is the Fair Work Act. Many of you would have heard of it. And now it includes a new right for workers around out-of-hours contact. It's also now been implemented in all modern awards as of 2 days ago. So it's really fresh. Wow. And that's, of course, why the recruitment industry is so interested in it, as are other industries. And in effect, the reform gives workers the right to refuse contact from their employer or from another person in relation to work outside their working hours. So if, for example, an employee gets an email, a phone call, a text message, social media comms outside of their work hours, then they can ignore it if it's not unreasonable to do so. And the contact doesn't need to just be from the employer. It can be, and often in the recruitment industry I find it will be, from clients, from candidates, from staff at other recruitment businesses with cross referrals, or it might be members of the general public. Now, I think that the most important caveat in all of this is that the employee can refuse the contact only if that refusal is reasonable.
Now, let's explore that. Because so there's so many bits in there. So first of all, I texted a client on a Sunday night because he needed to meet someone Monday morning, and I finally got the time. And we have a little bit of banter. His first response was, right to disconnect. And clearly I said, well, that doesn't come into place till tomorrow, so suck it. But that was really like me going, I didn't know if it applied to me, to a third party, but you're saying it does.
Look, it certainly does apply to a third party. It's not that you would be prohibited yourself in that specific situation you're talking about from contacting the individual. It's more so whether an employer, whether their contact would be considered to be unreasonable such that the individual didn't need to respond. And it really changes across industries and across role types. And there are certain factors that, say, the Commission will look at when it's considering whether an employee's refusal is unreasonable. They think about a whole range of things, like what was the reason for the contact, how that contact was made and how disruptive it is to the employee, how much the employee is compensated or paid extra for being available to perform work during the period that they're contacted, or working additional hours outside their ordinary hours of work.
Sorry to cut you off. How does this all get triggered? Like it's not like the ombudsman's going to, how do I say this? Ombudsman. Oh my goodness. It's not like they're going around and checking, right? So what's the trigger? What's the trigger for this to become an issue?
Well, I think the employee is the trigger. If the employee thinks that they're facing unreasonable contact out of hours, then they might say, nope, I'm not happy with this. I don't think this is part of my job. It's certainly not in my contract. I'm not being paid enough. My personal circumstances don't make this a reasonable request for me to be in contact at these hours of the day. So I think that really it's
So it's kind of like the same, like if you feel like you're getting bullied in the workplace, you go, it's the same kind of, the same avenue you go down to say, hey, this is, my employment is not treating me in the right way. I want you guys to have a look into it for me and see if you guys think this is reasonable or not.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think that raising workplace bullying is really relevant here, John, because at a broader level, there are legal obligations that are already in place which would regulate potentially these out-of-hours types of contacts. Just as an example, there's been a lot of discussion recently about psychosocial hazards in workplaces, and psychosocial hazards include things like unreasonable job demands. And if an employee is facing a psychosocial hazard in the workplace that causes them psychological injury, then that could potentially raise liability for an employer in terms of its compliance with state-based occupational health and safety laws. And it could create a situation where an employee makes a workers' compensation claim or makes another type of claim like breach of contract or adverse action or unfair dismissal or so on. So there's much broader liability here if an employer is contacting employees unreasonably out of hours, or if an employee is facing unreasonable work demands in the course of performing their usual functions.
And where can we, let's just say the intention's good, right? I think most people, like when we talk about these things, you bring up a lot of negative connotations, a lot of like stressful situations. Obviously, people have felt they're not treated correctly or not being compensated correctly. But let's go to the other side of the spectrum, right? Where most people, I believe, work, with good intent, and that can sometimes get lost. For those well-intended people, and let's just say it's me, I a lot of the time use the day for phone calls for work to deal, with internal calls and messaging and do the actual work. But sometimes I just sit on my laptop at night and I'll pump out emails, and it might go internally to John or whoever. They know that they don't need to respond, but should I have, say, on my signature, a clause that says, hey, like my intent here is to work on my hours. I don't expect you to respond. Like, is that stuff going to help us at all? Is there any room for that sort of thing, or is it a waste of time? What are your thoughts around that?
Sorry,
That's
for a
it.
second, okay? Just so I don't destroy the whole recording. Sorry, it's getting worse as we go.
That's okay. Do you want to get some water?
No, that's fine. So look, in answer to that, Brett, I'd say it's a great practice to have a statement on the bottom of your emails to say, look, I like to work this way, but don't feel obliged to reply out of hours. But I think there's probably more material things that employers certainly can be doing in order to make it clear what the expectations are of a role and what their practice is in terms of managing out of hours contact. And
Right.
On that front, I think one of the most important things that an employer can do is to be really clear within an employment contract. For instance, within that contract, are they just providing the ordinary hours of work, for instance, 9 a.m. to 5 p.m, but is there going to be a routine requirement for work to be done outside of those hours? Because if so, that really should be specified clearly in the contract of employment. And if it's not, then, there are additional risks of claims here. For instance, if the remuneration, whether it's in the form of an annualised salary or hourly rates or commission or a mix, does that remuneration take into consideration those reasonable additional hours that they're doing? If it doesn't, then there's not only an issue about whether it's reasonable to work out of hours, but also whether the employee is actually being paid appropriately. So that's one way we like to see an employer approach it within the contract, being really clear what are the working hours and what is the remuneration paid in satisfaction of. Another very important document that an employer should have in place is the position description that has a clear statement of what the job involves. For instance, is it going to require you to work with candidates at an international level that might require work across time zones? I'd also be considering how the role requirements are impacting an employee personally. If they're the primary caregiver of a child and you're asking them to do a meeting right in the middle of bedtime, then contact at that time of night is going to be really challenging for them to manage. And it could therefore be reasonable for them to insist that they disconnect at that time. So, there is a lot that an employer needs to consider in terms of how they're managing out-of-hours work, which goes well beyond the new legal reform in terms of right to disconnect.
What about in terms of like when Brett was saying before about people who have the right intention as employers and they're contacting their staff, but like, do you need to keep saying to your employees, I'm not expecting you to respond? Like, should that just be your like default, you're saying this, and then by extension, like say if you're part of an international company and when you've got people sending emails around the international network, should there be something that's saying, like, we've said in your employment contract you're not meant to be responding, and I'm just reiterating you're not meant to be responding to this, and you can respond to it back at work hours tomorrow, kind of thing? Do we need to keep reiterating this?
So just in answer to your question, John, I think lots of businesses are implementing out-of-hours contact policies, and that I have seen to be a really useful tool to set the expectations that suit the workplace and the roles that are active within the business. But beyond that, I think that it's incumbent on businesses to continue to have those open discussions with staff members, because this can really help to minimise the friction if people aren't aligned in terms of role expectations. So, what are the business's positions on things like when the employee may be expected to monitor or to read or respond to contact out of hours? What are the preferred out-of-hours contact channels? Would they prefer a text message or an email or a phone call? What are the paying conditions that might relate to that type of out-of-hours contact? Are they specifically paying certain amounts to compensate for work, say over the weekend, if somebody has a particular project that they need to work on that's going to cause them to be doing work on a Saturday night or late one evening because somebody's in a different time zone? And who needs to be aware of the out-of-hours contact arrangements? So, for instance, how's it being communicated within a team to say, look, Liz is going to be working over her period of annual leave. She wants to be contacted between 12 o'clock and 2 o'clock in the afternoon. That works well for her. Make sure you text her first so that she can make herself available. Things like that can really assist in terms of managing the expectations of workers and helping them not to feel excessive pressure from an employer when they are required to work those additional hours.
So on a few questions coming out of that, this information's gold, by the way. This is what I'm not seeing in the fin review.
It's different to what I expected, to be honest.
No, it's good.
Yeah.
In terms of making contact, text, email, phone, Teams, like whatever, is there different weighting to the style of communication, or we're not sure yet?
Sorry, is it different what, Brett? What was that?
Are there different weightings? So if I emailed you or if I called your home, is that going to have a different weighting of intrusiveness at the work? Yeah.
That's a great question, because one of the specific factors that the Commission considers is how disruptive that is to somebody's life when the contact is made, when they're assessing what is reasonable. So, if someone calls on your home phone line, I'm not sure anybody's still got one of those, but you can imagine that would be a lot more invasive into somebody's personal time. And employees these days are certainly much more sensitive to that. The world is so busy and our roles don't seem to ever end, do they? Especially not in the recruitment space. Like, you're always pushing yourselves to be available to candidates and to clients to find that perfect fit for them. And it can really encourage us to be making ourselves too available out of hours and not having sort of fixed hours of work. And that is a real drain on people personally. So I think, if we're considering, well, how can I minimise this disruption to somebody's life so that the contact, which I otherwise consider to be reasonable for the performance of the role, has as minimal impact on that individual as it possibly can. Yeah. Would it be best if I send them a Teams so I know that they're going to be logging in at 8 o'clock to check, to see what's happened in the Teams stream? Would that be best, or would it be better to send them an email so I know that, they'll receive it only in the morning once they start up for the day. So definitely we have to think about the method in terms of communicating with our staff, but setting that sort of thing in advance and asking the individual and saying what works best for you can go a long way towards appeasing everybody, especially in circumstances where we know that they are working so hard and have so much pressure on them to get things done with a greater degree of urgency than there was in the past.
Yeah, and do you see that there are going to be any particular sectors that are more prone to exposure? Like, are you already hearing like, oh, we've got to watch out for that sector or this sector because that's rife, or we're not sure yet?
Well, I mean, I would think that the recruitment industry is in itself one that we need to watch, because
I had someone text me at 9:30 last night asking me questions about stuff, and I was like, no.
I had someone call me on Christmas Day, but like, what, that's a candidate calling. You can't really do much about that. But I suppose you're saying if your employee is saying, take that call, why didn't you take that call? That could have been a placement. That's the problem, right?
Absolutely. And look, I mean, I do that myself all the time. I'm always monitoring my emails, but at the same time, that's the role that I've chosen to take on. But somebody, say, in a more junior recruitment level role, that may not be what they signed up for. We'd look at the employment contract. Have you made those disclosures to them? These are going to be the requirements for your role. But certainly, I think that the recruitment industry is one where, similar to other industries, we don't always have a great deal of visibility over our workers. They're working very flexibly, and often they're remunerated on a base salary, but also subject to commission payments.
Yeah.
So we know they're working really hard because they want that commission payment, but it also means they're working a lot out of hours. And I think that's problematic because we don't know when and how much they're working. And from a disconnecting perspective, well, what does that mean? When have they actually disconnected from work so that it might be unreasonable for us to make contact and require them to respond? And also from another perspective, I think in terms of simply the law, the Fair Work regulations, most specifically, they have very prescriptive terms in terms of requiring all employers to have certain time and wage records. If you've got an employee that you've got very little visibility over, we don't necessarily know when and how much they're working. And this can be a big problem if the Fair Work Ombudsman comes along and they require production of employee time records, because we may not be able to produce those records saying, well, they worked here and here and here. And so, perhaps they should have or should have received additional payment for it, and there might be exposure to underpayment.
If they're getting paid commission, though, is that reasonable payment for doing the after-hours work? Like, would that cover an employer?
Yeah, well, look, I mean, that would depend very much on the wording of the employment contract. I don't think that I have seen a contract in the recruitment industry recently that has been as specific as that, saying that commission payments are taken to satisfy ordinary hours of work plus reasonable additional hours. But, that would be desirable to sort of try to minimise the risk around an underpayment claim, as well as...
Should it be something that people are reissuing contracts now to kind of... basically reissuing new contracts with these new things in place to kind of say this is what the new law reforms are, so therefore we need to make sure we're covering this in our employment contracts with our staff and rewriting all their contracts?
Yeah, well, I mean, there has been significant change over the past few years which impacts on employment contracts. So I think any business needs to be looking at their contracts at this point in time. I wouldn't specifically be approaching it in terms of a right to disconnect issue. I think that there are more indirect ways in which a contract deals with that issue. And one is through modern awards. We know that the modern awards have been updated to reflect the right to disconnect reforms. And often in the recruitment industry, we don't see much consideration given to what modern awards might apply to a business in Australia. And in fact, depending on the level and the skills and the qualifications of the individual, there are awards that could apply. The Labour Market Assistance Award, the Clerks and the Miscellaneous Awards might be relevant. So a contract, first and foremost, needs to reflect what modern award might be relevant for that employee and for their operations. Second of all, I think the remuneration clause always needs to be carefully worded. For instance, if you've got an annualised salary in place, then you need to specify what it's paid in satisfaction of. Is it based on 38 hours of work per week, because if so, the business might be exposed to a claim for additional payments if the employee is routinely working additional hours. And if the worker is expected to work out of hours to get the job done, then really they need specific compensation for that, and it should be clearly expressed in the contract.
Is there this is a new law for us, but is there anywhere else globally that has a similar law? Has this been copied from the UK or another jurisdiction that we can kind of see how this plays out over time?
Well, yes. I mean, there are many jurisdictions overseas where there have been similar legislative protections for workers. There actually have been protections in Australia which have related to the right to disconnect. For instance, Victoria Police has had an enterprise agreement in place for many years which specifically allows employees to say, no, I'm done for the day. But I think at that broader level, there have been and are plenty of laws in place that require an employer to consider what is reasonable in terms of working hours, what goes beyond reasonable, what might constitute a risk to the health and safety of a worker if they're working excessive hours. So in a way, this situation has already been managed under Australian law as well as in foreign jurisdictions. But I think that to codify it in the way that the government has will certainly serve to emphasise an employee's right to have that separation between their work and their personal life, and will probably encourage legal claims, if not directly in the new jurisdiction in terms of seeking a stop order from the Fair Work Commission, but otherwise certainly in a range of other areas where they have potential rights and causes of action. And
I'm going to wrap this up with one more question, which I think I'm just curious about now. It is, as of recording this Wednesday, the 28th of August, the new laws came out on Monday, the 26th of August, so 2 days ago. Are we aware of any claims already triggered around this?
I don't think anyone can move that fast. I would just note that for small businesses, this law will apply from the 26th of August next year. So that's any business with less than 15 employees, and for employees of small businesses. But certainly, if you haven't got your house in order already, then it's a point of priority.
Okay, cool. And look, lastly, for everyone listening at home, whether they're recruiters, whether they're just, they own a business or whether they work within it, if they feel like, oh crap, I'm exposed here, I haven't looked at my contracts, I haven't got these clauses in place, I haven't got these policies in place, are you the sort of person that they can go to ask for advice and get some of that help with?
We'd love to hear from you. Absolutely.
Okay. So we'll put we'll pop your details in wherever you're listening to this. It'll be below. Email, contact numbers, everything like that. So, Liz, that was phenomenal. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Brett. Thanks, John. Good to join you both.
Yeah, excellent. Guys, that's all we have time for today. As always, like, share, subscribe. This is one you want to share with your friends because it's going to help someone in your networks. As always, have an amazing day and may all your deals come true.